Hi guys, we're going to go over some literary terms for review. We have a test coming up, so use this for your own benefit and help you with study time. First word we're going to go over is alliteration. In alliteration, you repeat sounds. So Amber's awesome apples is a good example of alliteration. Typically, it's the first sound of words that are making alliteration. An anachronism, it means backward in time, but it's basically when the writer of a piece puts in historically inaccurate events. So a character from medieval times might have a weapon or a type of clothing that didn't exist back then, or you could have something that's even crazier, like you could have cavemen flying airplanes, right? That didn't happen. So those are examples of anachronisms. An analogy is a literary technique where two unrelated objects are compared together. So we could say raising children and growing a garden are the same because they both require nurturing and a lot of attentive care. That would be an analogy. An antagonist. In a story, the antagonist plays the opposite of the protagonist. Sometimes they're a villain, but not always, and they usually create stress and drama in stories. Assonance. It's similar to alliteration, but it's the repetition of vowel sounds within words, phrases, or sentences. So it's, again, the same repetition of sound, but it's not quite the same. Catharsis. So in Greek plays, we see this a lot where the author is really trying to get the audience to have an emotional response to something. Typically, there's a big emotional scene, and then it's kind of followed by all the loose ends being tied up, and a lot of people really enjoy that. Dialogue, simply put, it's where conversations are happening between characters. We see this a lot in plays, as plays are almost exclusively dialogue, but we also see it in novels, just whenever two characters are speaking with one another. Foreshadowing is another technique used by authors, and they use certain words or phrases to hint to the audience what might happen. So they might be using certain words with connotation that are either positive or negative that give you a hint of where a situation or a character is headed. Hyperbole is an extreme exaggeration. So we might be tired enough to sleep for 1,000 years. We might say, oh, I'm so tired I could sleep for 1,000 years. Now, we couldn't literally sleep for 1,000 years. It's an extreme exaggeration, so that's an example of hyperbole. An idiom is a phrase that has a figurative meaning. So it has no literal meaning. Like the example here, we see barking up the wrong tree. It doesn't mean that a dog is barking at a tree or that anything is climbing a tree. It just means that we're headed in the wrong direction. Irony is when there are two contradicting meanings of the same situation. So we can see that in an example in this picture. The sign says perfection, but it's clearly broken, and so that would be a good example of irony. Metaphor, it's a figure of speech that makes a comparison by relating different things to one another directly. So in this example, we see the little guy wearing a blue shirt with an M for metaphor. He says, "You're a mountain." He doesn't really mean that the guy is literally a mountain. He just means that the guy is big. Simile is a literary term where we use like or as to compare two different things to show a common quality between them. So if we go back to this slide, we see the gentleman wearing a red shirt. He says, "You're as skinny as a rail." That's a good example of a simile. And there's some resources I use to get my definitions.